They called Calvin Rhodes the last man in Page County who still farmed in curves. At first, it was just something people said over coffee. A passing joke, the kind that gets tossed around in the early morning, between talk of seed prices, weather, and whether the rain would come in time. But the phrase stayed. It followed him out of the cafe, through the co-op, into the parts store, and across the edges of fields where men leaned on truck doors and watched each other work. The last man who still farmed in curves. It sounded like a description. But the way they said it made it clear it wasn't meant as one. Because by the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, everything in Page County was moving in a different direction. Fields were being opened up. Old ridges were pushed down. Grassed waterways were plowed under. The small bends and interruptions in the land, the places that once forced a man to slow down, lift a planter, and guide a machine by hand, were being erased. The new fields looked cleaner, straighter, faster, and most important of all, they ran in perfect lines. Corn rows stretching from the top of a hill all the way to the bottom without a break. Planters guided by GPS, moving steady and straight, the operator barely touching the wheel. From above, the land looked measured, controlled, ordered. That was what everyone wanted. Everyone, except Calvin Rhodes. His farm sat just outside Clarinda, across a stretch of rolling ground that didn't look like much from the road, but changed shape the moment you stepped into it. The land rose, and fell, and rose again. Long, soft slopes, like waves that had settled and hardened over time. And across those slopes ran lines. Not straight ones, curved ones. They followed the contour of the land, bending gently across the hillsides, like someone long ago had told the water, if you're going to move downhill, you're going to have to turn first. Those lines had been there since his father's time, and Calvin had never taken them out. From the edge of his machine shed, early in the morning, you could see the difference clearly. His neighbor's fields dropped straight down the hills like arrows. His didn't. His rows wrapped across the slope, turned, adjusted, moved with the shape of the ground instead of cutting through it. Between the rows were low earthen ridges, nothing dramatic, but enough to slow anything that tried to run straight across them. And lower still, where the water was meant to leave, there were strips of grass. Wide, thick, green, 30 feet across in some places. They didn't grow corn. They didn't grow soybeans. They didn't make money. At least, not in a way you could see on a yield report. People called them wasted ground. 30 feet just to grow grass, someone said once at the parts counter. Only Calvin would give up land like that. Another man laughed. Not just land. Slowing down his whole operation with those curves. Heads nodded, because the math seemed obvious. Straight rows saved time. Time saved fuel. Fuel saved money. And money was what everyone was trying to hold on to. In that kind of thinking, Calvin Rhodes looked like a man choosing to lose. Mason Klein had told him that more than once. Mason was an equipment dealer out of Shenandoah. He sold newer tractors, bigger planters, GPS guidance systems that could keep a machine on a perfect line across a field without drift or overlap. He believed in efficiency the way some men believe in weather forecasts, as something you trusted until proven wrong. He had been out to Calvin's farm several times. Each time, he parked his clean truck in the yard, stepped out with papers in hand, and pointed toward the fields. "Cal," he said one afternoon in early spring, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." Calvin stood by the shed, one hand resting on the tire of an older tractor, the other holding a wrench. He didn't answer right away, just finished what he was doing, wiped his hands, and looked up. "I'm doing fine." "You doing all right," Mason said, "but you're not doing it efficiently. If you level those ridges, open up those fields, run straight rows, You'll save time every single pass. Less overlap, less wasted seed, less fuel, and more acres actually producing. He showed Calvin the numbers, clean numbers, straight numbers, the kind that lined up neatly on a page. More efficiency, more usable acreage, less waste. Calvin looked at them, then looked past them, and asked the one question Mason never forgot. If I take those ridges out, where does the water go? Mason frowned slightly. Down the hill, same as always. And if it runs all the way down? Mason shifted his weight. You're no-till. The residue will hold it. That's what it's for. Calvin nodded slowly. And if the rain comes harder than that? Mason didn't answer right away. The wind moved across the yard. Somewhere behind the shed, a loose panel tapped softly against its frame. Out on the slope, one of the grass waterways ran bright green against the darker soil. Mason folded the papers. Cal, nobody farms like this anymore. I know. Then why keep it? Calvin looked out across the land. Because the soil doesn't know your equipment is new, he said. That was the kind of answer that didn't fit into a conversation about efficiency. Mason gave a small smile, packed his papers away, got back into his truck. He wasn't angry. He just didn't understand. And he wasn't the only one. At the coffee shop, men talked about Calvin the way they talked about someone holding on to something long after it had stopped making sense. Planting 10 more acres if he cleared those waterways. Those curves are killing his planting speed. Everything about that place is slower than it should be. No one said it with malice, just certainty. Calvin heard some of it. Not all. He didn't go looking for it. And he didn't argue when it found him. If anyone asked him directly, he only ever said one thing. Straight lines help a machine move faster. Water doesn't care about straight lines. People usually laughed after that. Not because it was funny, because it sounded old. But Calvin wasn't looking at the field the way they were. He wasn't seeing rows, or speed, or efficiency. He was seeing soil. Dark soil, soft soil, living soil. The kind that smelled different after rain. The kind that held together when you picked it up. The kind that took years, decades, to build, and minutes to lose if you let water run far enough, fast enough. He saw that soil sitting on top of those hills, like a thin blanket over something much harder beneath it. And he knew, if the water ever got a clean run at it, that blanket wouldn't stay there long. One morning in late April, Calvin drove his father's old tractor along one of the curved ridges on the east field. The paint was faded. The metal worn smooth where hands had held it for years. It wasn't the fastest machine on the farm, it wasn't the most efficient, but it fit the land. It could move where the bigger machines didn't want to. Calvin used it for the quiet work. Fixing low spots in the ridges. Clearing the entrances to the waterways, keeping the system working, the way it had always worked. His son Ben stood at the edge of the slope, shovel in hand, watching. He was old enough now to run the newer equipment. Old enough to see how other farms looked. And how theirs didn't. Dad, Ben said, Mason says the new monitor can follow contour if we map it. Yeah. So, we're keeping all this. Calvin stopped the tractor. Let the engine idle down. What do you see when you look at their fields? He asked. Ben looked out across the neighboring land. They're faster than us. What else? Ben didn't answer. Calvin nodded toward the bottom of the slope. Wait until after a big rain, he said. He said it like it wasn't important. Like it was just something to notice. But it stayed with Ben. And it stayed with the land, because sooner or later, the rain always comes. Calvin Rhodes did not learn to farm from a manual. He learned it from watching water. When he was a boy, his father would take him out after storms. Not before, not during, after. When the rain had already done whatever it was going to do. When the sky cleared and the ground was still soft enough to show what had happened. "Don't look at the crop," his father would say. "Look at the dirt." They would walk the fields slowly. No rush. Boots sinking just enough to leave prints that filled with water as they moved. The rows didn't matter yet. The yield didn't matter yet. What mattered was what the water had done. His father, Earl Rhodes, didn't talk much. But when he did, it was always about the same thing. Where the water started, where it sped up, where it turned, and where it took something with it. There were places on the hills where you could see it clearly. Thin lines at first, barely noticeable. A faint discoloration where the surface had been disturbed. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd step right over it. But Earl would stop, point with the toe of his boot. "See that?" he'd say. Calvin would nod, even before he fully understood. That's where it begins. A raindrop hits bare ground. It knocks loose something small. So small you'd never miss it. Another drop hits, then another, and the small thing joins something larger. A thin film of water, then a trickle, then a line, then something that has direction. They would follow those lines downhill. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they grew. Sometimes they cut deeper than they had any right to. And sometimes they didn't stop. That was the part Earl always paid attention to. Not the beginning. Not even the middle. The length. How far did it run? He would ask. Calvin would look up the hill, then back down again. If the water had a clear path, uninterrupted, it changed. It didn't just move. It gathered. It picked up speed. It picked up weight. And somewhere along the way, it started carrying things with it. That was the moment it stopped being water and started being loss. Earl would kneel sometimes, pick up a handful of soil, rub it between his fingers. "This didn't grow in a year," he'd say. Calvin would watch the way it fell back to the ground. Slow, soft, like something that belonged exactly where it was. "Takes longer than that." He never said how long. He didn't need to, because the lesson wasn't about time. It was about direction. If the water could run far enough, it would take whatever it wanted. The first time Calvin really understood it, he was maybe 12. There had been a storm the night before. Not the biggest one, but enough. The kind that rattled the windows and kept you awake long enough to know it mattered. The next morning, Earl woke him early. "Come on," he said. They walked out to the east slope. The ground was darker there, wet, heavy. And halfway down the hill, something was different. A cut. Not deep, not yet, but clear. A line where the soil had been pulled away. Exposed something lighter underneath. Something that didn't look like it belonged on the surface. Calvin stared at it. "What is that?" Earl didn't answer right away. He stepped over it, then turned back. "That's what's under everything you're standing on." Calvin looked again. The dark soil was gone in that strip, replaced by something yellow, harder, dull. "Will it come back?" he asked. Earl shook his head once. "Not in your lifetime." That was the moment it changed. Before that, soil was just ground. After that, it was something you could lose. Over the years, Calvin started to see it everywhere. Places where the soil stayed. Places where it didn't. Places where the water slowed. And places where it ran clean through, like it had been invited. The difference wasn't random. It followed patterns. Lines. Interruptions. Distance. The fields that held their soil had something in common. They didn't let water run very far. Not in one shot. Something always got in its way. A ridge. A curve. A strip of grass. Something that forced it to turn, or slow, or spread out before it could gather enough strength to take anything with it. The fields that lost their soil had something in common too. They were open, clean, unbroken, perfect for a machine. and perfect for water. By the time Calvin was old enough to run equipment on his own, he already knew what most men didn't think about anymore. That a field wasn't just something you planted. It was something you managed, even when it rained. When his father got older, the work shifted. Calvin took over more of the driving, more of the planting, more of the decisions. But the questions didn't change. Earl still walked the fields after storms, still stopped at the same places, still looked for the same signs. And every time Calvin suggested straightening something, opening up a section, making it easier to run, Earl would ask the same thing. Where's the water going to go? It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an argument. It was just the question, the one that sat underneath everything else. Yield, speed, efficiency, all of it. Because none of it mattered if the soil didn't stay where it was supposed to be. And soil only stays if you give water a reason to slow down. By the time Calvin took over the farm completely, that lesson was already part of how he saw the land. Not as rows, not as acres, but as movement, water moving, soil staying, or leaving, and every ridge his father had built, every curve cut into the hillside, every strip of grass running downhill, wasn't in the way. It was the reason the soil was still there. By the late 1990s, the county began to change. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once, the way things do when a better machine shows up. The equipment got bigger, planters wider, tractors heavier, and the guidance systems smarter. GPS came in first as something new, then something useful, then something no one wanted to farm without. A man could line up at the edge of a field, set his path, and let the machine hold it. Straight, perfect, every pass the same as the last. No drift, no overlap, no wasted motion. It didn't just make farming easier. It made it cleaner, more precise, more efficient. And once men saw that, it was hard to go back. The fields began to change to match the machines. Ridges that once cut across the slope were pushed down. Waterways were filled in. The small interruptions in the land, the things that had once slowed a man down, were removed, because they slowed the machine down too. Where there had once been curves, there were now straight lines, from the top of the hill, all the way to the bottom, unbroken, uninterrupted, fast. And for a while, it looked like the right decision. Planting took less time, fewer turns, fewer stops, less seed wasted on uneven edges, more acres planted in a day, more acres planted in a season. The numbers worked. They always did. At the co-op, the conversations shifted. Men didn't just talk about crops anymore. They talked about speed. How many acres you cover yesterday? How fast you running that planter? You still messing with those curves, or you finally straightened things out? There was a rhythm to it, a sense that everyone was moving forward, together, towards something better, towards something faster. Calvin listened to those conversations, sometimes from a table, sometimes from the doorway, sometimes just long enough to hear his name come up, and then step back outside before anyone noticed. He didn't argue, didn't correct, didn't try to explain what he had been taught, because he understood something most of them didn't need to think about yet. The problem with moving fast is you don't always see what you're leaving behind. Mason came back again. Different year. Same conversation. Different numbers. Better equipment. Stronger case. You're losing ground, Cal, he said, standing beside a newer planter parked at the edge of the yard. Not just time. Real acres. You clear those ridges, open these fields up. You're looking at another 30, maybe 40 acres you can actually plant. Calvin leaned on the fence. Maybe. And your speed goes up. Fuel goes down. Less wear on the equipment. Less frustration in the cab. Everything gets smoother. Mason pointed out across the hills. You see that? That's where this is going. Everybody's moving that direction. Everybody. Calvin followed his hand with his eyes. The neighboring fields were already there. Long, straight runs. No breaks. No curves. From a distance, they looked perfect, like nothing could interrupt them. And when it rains? Calvin asked. Mason exhaled through his nose. Not annoyed, just tired of that question. It'll be fine. You're running no-till. You've got residue. You're not farming bare ground. It's not the 1930s anymore. Calvin nodded once. That's what everyone says. Mason didn't push further. There wasn't much point, because this wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about what a man believed would still matter, 10 years from now. The pressure didn't come all at once. It built, season by season, comment by comment, suggestion by suggestion, until one day, Calvin realized something. He wasn't just farming differently. He was farming alone. Field by field, the curves disappeared around him, the ridges flattened, the waterways gone, the interruptions erased. What was left was speed, clean, efficient, uniform, everything the new machines wanted, everything the water wanted too. At home, nothing changed. Calvin still ran the older tractor along the ridges, still checked the waterways after rain, still walked the slopes in the mornings, before the wind picked up. Ben started helping more, learning the same way Calvin had, not from charts, not from screens, but from what the ground showed you, if you were willing to look. Why don't we just straighten it? Ben asked one afternoon. He wasn't challenging, just asking. Calvin didn't answer right away. He was looking at a section of ridge where the soil had settled slightly over the winter. He climbed down, took a shovel, pressed it into the ground, lifted, turned the soil over. Dark, still holding together, still where it belonged. He set the shovel back. Because once you let it run, he said quietly, you don't get to decide where it stops. Ben didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had seen enough by then to understand the question, even if he didn't yet understand the answer. By the time the early 2000s passed, there were almost no curved fields left in that part of the county. Except one. Calvin Rhodes' farm. From the road, it stood out. Not because it was better. Not because it was worse. But because it didn't match. The lines bent where others didn't. Grass showed where others planted. The shape of the land was still visible, where everyone else had tried to smooth it away. It looked older, slower, out of place. And for years, that's exactly what people thought it was. Until the summer came, when the rain didn't stop. The rain started in the late afternoon, not unusual at first. A line of clouds building low over the horizon, darker than the rest of the sky, but nothing a farmer in Page County hadn't seen 100 times before. By dinner, the light had changed. The kind of light that turns everything flat and gray, like the land is holding its breath. Then the wind dropped, and the rain came. It didn't fall. It drove, hard, fast, relentless. The kind of rain that doesn't give the ground time to take it in. Within minutes, water was already moving. Across roads, across driveways, across fields, looking for a path. On the straight fields, it found one. From the tops of the hills, the water began to run. Clean at first, then darker, then heavier. It picked up speed as it moved downhill. Nothing stopped it. Nothing turned it. Nothing broke its run. 1,200 feet of open slope, all in one direction. And somewhere along that run, it changed. It stopped being just rain. It became force. It carved. It pulled. It took. The first cuts were small, thin lines forming between the rows. Easy to miss if you weren't looking close. But they didn't stay small. Not in that kind of rain. They widened, deepened, joined together. What had been rows became channels. What had been soil began to move. And once it started moving, it didn't stop. By nightfall, parts of the fields were already coming apart. Water ran thick and brown, carrying with it everything loose enough to lift. Topsoil, residue, fertilizer, seed, the ground itself, sliding away inch by inch. On some slopes, the cuts opened into something worse. Not lines, not channels, but wounds. 3 feet deep in places, wide enough to stand in, cutting straight down through the dark soil, into the yellow beneath. The part no one wanted to see, the part that didn't grow anything. The rain didn't let up. Hour after hour, it kept falling, faster than the soil could take it, faster than anything on the surface could hold it. Because nothing on the surface was meant to hold that much water, all at once. Except one thing. On Calvin Road's land, the water moved differently. It still came hard, still came fast, but it didn't get far. 200 feet down the slope, and it hit the first ridge. The water gathered there, slowed, spread, then turned, running sideways instead of down, following the line of the land, instead of cutting through it. It had to. There was nowhere else to go. Behind each ridge, the water built up, filled the channels, spilled over in places, but never ran clean from top to bottom, never got the distance it needed to become destructive. Every time it tried, something stopped it, turned it, broke it, and when it finally left the field, it didn't leave on bare ground. It left through grass, thick, dense, holding its movement before it reached the creek. The difference wasn't quiet, it wasn't subtle. It was visible. By morning, the storm had moved on. The sky cleared. The air felt heavy and clean at the same time. And the county began to look at what had happened. Along the roads, you could see it first. Mud pushed up against culverts. Water pooled where it shouldn't be. Sediment spread across gravel like someone had dumped it there on purpose. Then the fields. The straight fields looked torn, not damaged, not stressed. Torn. Rows cut apart, sections missing. The dark topsoil gone from the slopes, replaced by that same yellow layer underneath. The one Calvin had pointed out to Ben years before. The one his father had said would not come back. It was everywhere now. Some places had lost more than others, but none of them had escaped it. Not completely. Because the water had been given exactly what it needed. Distance, speed, freedom. And it had taken everything it could carry. Calvin's fields looked different. Not untouched, not perfect, but intact. The rows still there. The soil still dark. The shape of the land still holding together. There were marks, places where the water had tried, small cuts, shallow lines. But nothing that had broken the field, nothing that had reached down into the layer beneath. Nothing that wouldn't heal. From the road, you could see the line where it changed. One field, then the next. One holding, one opened. One still soil. One already losing it. Ray Cooper, one of the farmers who had cleared his ridges years before, parked his truck at the edge of one of those slopes. He stood there a long time, looking down, then across, then back again. On his side, the damage was clear. On Calvin's, it wasn't. Same rain, same hill, different result. He climbed over the fence, walked into Calvin's field, bent down, picked up a handful of soil, dark, still together, still there. He let it fall back through his fingers slowly, then looked up across the curves, the ridges, the grass strips cutting through the field like quiet instructions written into the land. The system wasn't old. It wasn't outdated. It wasn't inefficient. It was working. That afternoon, trucks started pulling into Calvin Road's driveway. One, then another, then more. Men who hadn't stopped by in years. Men who had laughed. Men who had moved on. Now standing in the yard, not saying much at first, just looking out across the fields. Trying to understand what they were seeing. Calvin didn't explain right away. He didn't need to. The land already had. They stayed longer than they planned to. That was the first thing Calvin noticed. Men who usually stopped for 10 minutes. Stayed an hour. Men who came to look. Stayed to walk. Boots on wet ground. Hands in pockets. Eyes moving across the field. Trying to piece something together that no one had needed to understand before. They didn't ask questions right away. They didn't argue. They didn't joke. They just looked. At the ridges. At the curves. At the strips of grass that had once been called wasted ground. At the soil. Still where it was supposed to be. And then, slowly, the questions came. How far apart are these ridges? Calvin answered. How do you keep the water from cutting through the channels? Calvin showed them. What happens when it overtops? It still slows, he said. It still turns. They nodded. Some wrote things down. Some didn't. But all of them were thinking the same thing. What would my field look like if I still had mine? Mason came back that evening. Not with papers this time. Not with numbers. Just himself. He walked out into the field without saying anything at first. Stood beside one of the ridges. Looked along its curve. Then down the slope. Then back again. I told you to take these out, he said finally. Calvin nodded. You did. I showed you the numbers. You did. Mason let out a slow breath. I wasn't wrong about the math. No. Mason looked out across the neighboring fields. The cuts. The exposed ground. The places where something had been taken and wasn't coming back. I was wrong about what mattered, he said. Calvin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The field already had. For a while, no one talked about rebuilding anything. It was too soon. Too raw. The damage was still there. Visible. Fresh. The kind of thing you had to live with before you could decide what to do about it. But the idea had been planted. Quietly. The way most important things are. Not in meetings. Not in reports. In a field. After a storm. The next year, a few men started asking different questions. Not about speed. Not about acres per hour. But about water. Where it moved. Where it slowed. Where it needed to be turned. The same questions Calvin had been asking all along. Some of them rebuilt ridges. Not all. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to change how the water moved. Enough to keep some of the soil where it was. Others didn't. Couldn't. Or wouldn't. And the difference didn't show up all at once. It never does. It showed up slowly. Year by year. Hilltops that didn't produce quite like they used to. Slopes that needed more input to give the same output. Places where something felt thinner, but couldn't be measured in a single season. Because loss like that doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in pieces. Calvin's fields didn't change much. They still curved. Still slowed him down. Still forced him to work around something, instead of through it. Ben took over more of the work. Learned the same patterns. Walked the same slopes. Saw the same things. One evening, years later, he stood on the ridge with his father, looking out across the land. The curves, the grass strips, the long shadows stretching across the hills. They still say we're slower, Ben said. Calvin nodded. We are. Ben looked down at the soil beneath his boots, then across to the neighboring fields. They still say we could be more efficient. Calvin gave a small smile. We could. Ben waited, then asked the question his father had asked for years. Where would the water go? Calvin didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Ben already knew. That was the point. The sun dropped lower. The lights softened. And across the hills of Page County, the difference was still there. Not in the machines. Not in the speed. Not in the lines. In the soil. Where it stayed. Where it didn't. And who had decided, years before, that it was worth keeping. Some men farmed straight rows. Some men farmed curves. But in the end, the crop didn't grow in the GPS. It grew in whatever soil was left on the hill.